All right, I believe we should be live any second now. And let's see. Yes. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Hoot. We're starting our fall season of episodes. We're hoping to have them on the same cadence as before. So obviously subscribe if you wanna, keep it being informed about what we're doing. As always, I'll be looking at the live chat, and if you have any questions about what I'm talking about, feel free to ask questions as they come in the live chat, and I will do my best to answer them. Today we will be talking about Envoy Filter CRD in Istio. I have a little bit of slides kind of outlining the topic, and then we're going to do a live demo. Obviously, if there's any questions, feel free to ask, and we will wrap it up after then. The demo will show how you can do rate limiting with Istio inside the cluster using the Envoy Filter CRD. So with that, let's move on to the slides. Here we go. So Envoy Filter CRD, let's first describe it, kind of what it does, why do we need it, why do we use it, what's the motivation. The idea is that Istio allows you to have a lot of use cases with the Istio API, but essentially the Istio API eventually gets translated to Envoy API, right? And there might be some use cases you want to deploy that are not exposed in the Istio API. And that's where the Envoy Filter CRD comes in handy, because we can use it to enable those use cases in Envoy. Right, so essentially it gives us a way to directly access the Envoy API using Istio. It kind of turns Istio to a general purpose control plane for Envoy. Right, is this, one second, I think the slides are not changing for some reason. As always, something's up. But that's generally the motivation. Now, one second, let me see if I can restart the slideshow to see if it'll help. So the idea is that we can get Istio to work and deliver Envoy configuration directly without kind of, I'll just share the whole desktop so you can see the slides. Here we go. Without kind of relying on the Istio API to be developed to cover this use case. All right, so next, why not? Why would we not use an Envoy Filter CRD? First, it's considered a break glass config. Istio cannot validate that the configuration is correct, unlike its own APIs where it can validate them. It is more complex to use, and I'll show you an example so you'll understand exactly why. And it's currently an alpha API, which means that config YAMLs that you write today may break in a future Istio release. So let's, with that in mind, let's look at the structure of it. And from the Istio docs, you can see that, just remove this, here we go. You can see that an Envoy Filter CRD has kind of 3 top level fields in its spec. It has the workload selector, it has config patches, and has priority. Priority, it just defines the priority in which it will apply. We're not going to talk about it more. Workload selector essentially is used to select a workload, essentially a deployment. You give it labels and it can select to apply this certain Envoy Filter CRD to those workloads, right? So you can filter the workloads, the sidecars that are impacted by this Envoy Filter, right? So remember, this Envoy Filter can be used to add configuration to the Envoy sidecar, and this just selects which sidecars you want to add the configuration to. And then the config patches part, the config patches, they that's the part that adds the actual and modifies the Envoy live configuration. Right, so with that, let me go over the next slide. Yeah, I think this is a better view. Let's look at the structure of the config patch. So the Envoy config patch is a list of this object that has these three fields: apply to, match, and patch. Apply to says which part of the Envoy config we're changing. It could be the HTTP filters, could be TCP filters, could be the list of clusters, things like that. And the match part is further to limit which object we're changing. So for example, we can say, I want to merge this configuration into an existing listener, so I can match on the specific listener I want. Right, so apply to would be the listeners, and the match would be the specific listener that I want to match on. And then finally, the patch itself has an operation, which is what are we doing? We can merge. So for example, we can merge additional fields to listener. So let's say Istio exposes, knobs to certain parts of an Envoy listener, and you can use a merge to add more settings, right? Needless to say, this means that you have to know the Envoy configuration, right? There's no Istio abstractions on top of it. And then the value, that's the core of the Envoy Filter CRD, right? That's essentially a JSON that gets applied onto the Envoy config based on all the previous semantics we talked about, all the previous fields that we talked about. So that's kind of the gist. It looks simple. That's the gist of how an Envoy Filter CRD behaves, right? And with that, let me overview the documentation a bit more, and then we'll jump right into a demo. So, first thing first, the demo we will be working on is based on the Istio rate limit demo, and you can see there'll be in the show notes, there'll be links to the demo. I slightly changed it because I wanted it to work in cluster instead of on the ingress. And everything will be available in our GitHub repo, so you can go to GitHub solo.io/Hoot. Once I'm done with the episode, I will upload all the code I used for this demo to there, and you can read it there. So this is the Istio reference documentation for the Envoy Filter, and it comes with a bunch of examples you can look at. And after the example, you have all these configurations where we talk about. So let's overview, for example, the first example here. So you can see you have an Envoy Filter, right? You apply it on a network filter, and you want the sidecar outbound one, and you want this listener, right? The listener with port 9307, and you wanted you're matching on the TCP proxy, right? Now the patch means insert before, so you'll insert whatever patch, whatever value you're patching just before the TCP proxy filter. And the value, the operation that we're doing is the value that the JSON value that we're adding before, that we're inserting before, is obviously because it's in the filter chain, it'll be a filter, and it has a name and a type config here. Obviously dot. We don't need the full config to understand this. So that's kind of the structure. With that, let's go to our demo. I've prepared here an environment of Istio with the book info. You can see that Istio is deployed here, and you can see that we have book info. This is Istio. In addition, and this is based on the rate limit Istio tutorial, which I said will be linked in the README of this folder. You can review that later. Also deploy the rate limit server and Redis for the rate limit server. Now, we did an episode specifically on rate limiting, so if you want to understand the structure, I highly recommend you go back and view that episode. I'm not going to go too much into the details of what these pods are, but I'll just give a brief overview. This rate limit server is a stateless server that just answers the question, should a certain request be rate limited? And Redis is where that server stores its state. All right, so let's do some curling. I should mention that the rate limit I want to apply is to the review service. So when the product page accesses the review service, I want to put rate limits there, right? And you see when I do curl, nothing is being rate limited, right? And let's review the config that I have on the cluster. So let's look at the config map for the rate limit server. And you can see the rate limit server is configured that if a path with review 0, give it a rate limit of 1 per minute, and any other path, give it a rate limit of 100 calls per minute, right? So review /0, and when I make this curl, it's essentially the product service calling out to reviews with ID 0 in the review service. If we go to the book info API, just to have this illustration here, a good book info example, we're targeting this error, right? Product page is going to reviews, and that's the connection we want to rate limit. All right, so why is nothing happening even though the server is configured? Because we have not configured the sidecar to check if there's any need to be rate limits, and that's exactly where the Envoy Filter CRD comes in. So let me minimize the console here, and we'll go to the Envoy Filter that we're about to apply, and we can see what does it have. So we're applying an Envoy Filter, and again, this is based on the Istio example. There will be links in the README, and it's slightly modified, but what we're doing is we're selecting, our workload selector is app reviews. We're applying an HTTP filter, right? So we're applying to the HTTP filter chain. Our context where we want to apply is the sidecar inbound, because I want it on incoming connections. Every connection that reaches the reviews, I want to see if I need to rate limit it. And then I'm matching on the router filter. And a router filter, if you don't know in Envoy, that's the last filter on the filter chain. That's a filter that does the upstream request. So the router filter has to be the last filter, and usually policy stuff will be before the router filter, just before it goes upstream to the review service itself. So what are we inserting before, right? We're inserting something before the router filter, and that is another HTTP filter, the rate limit HTTP filter, with this config. This is the config for the rate limit filter itself. And essentially we say, okay, use configuration domain reviews rate limit, and this needs to match the domain configured for the server. So as we can see, these two match, so we're good here. And then we say the rate limit service is defined in a cluster name rate limit cluster. And Istio does not define this cluster, right? So what do? We have another patch to define the cluster, right? So we apply it to the cluster list. We match on one service, otherwise the patch will apply to all clusters. We use the add operation to add a new cluster, and we add a new strict DNS cluster to Envoy that's going to ratelimit.default, which is our rate limit service as deployed in this cluster. So this patch will add another cluster to Envoy, right? And this is the Envoy, right? Both this section and this section are Envoy configurations, right? You wouldn't find them in the Istio reference docs. You'll have to go to the Envoy reference docs to see the valid values here, right? So this is basically just adding a cluster or an upstream, depending how you call it, and just saying, you know, this anything that goes here will eventually go to the rate limit service. All right, now even if you apply this to, still nothing will not happen, because we have not defined. We have defined a filter, right? But we also need to define something on the route. We need to tell the filter what type of descriptors to send to the rate limit server. If you're not 100% sure what descriptors are, we went to that in great detail in our previous Hoot on rate limiting, so do check that out. I'll just, you know, give a brief overview as I read our next Envoy Filter CRD. So our next Envoy Filter CRD, again, label selector, config patches. It applies to a virtual host on the sidecar inbound to any virtual host. And then we merge, because we don't want to add anything, right? We want to modify the existing one and add stuff to it. So we merge operation, and the value that we add is rate limits. And again, to know what this means, you have to go to the Envoy docs. Essentially, what will happen here that once the rate limit filter activates as part of the data path, it will ask the rate limit service should it rate limit, and it sends it the descriptors with the name path, and the value would be the path, right? This is the path pseudo header. If you're familiar with HTTP2, this is how you get the path in the form of an HTTP2 header, right? Colon path. So this will essentially be /review/0 or /review/1, right? /review/ the review ID, the product ID. So let's apply this filter, and I have a shortcut here called CAF, which is a kubectl apply -f. Very good, everything's applied. In the meantime, if anybody has any questions, that will be a good time to ask. And let's do the curl again. So again, what this curl does, I go to the product page API, and I ask it for product 0 reviews. And in order to get product 0 reviews, the product page will go to the review service and ask it for that review of product ID 0, and the path will be /reviews/0. So one time everything's good, it's working. Second time, and why not? It should. Oh, here we go. I guess it took a second to propagate. And what we can see that after, from now on till the rest of the minute, we can see we get too many requests, and this limit should reset by our server config, which is right here, 1 unit per minute. And you can see that if we go and ask for a different product review, we can do that a lot more. In fact, I should have a for loop in here. Here we go. Let's do that 100 times. And after 100 times, we can see that we finally should get response denied for reviews 1. You see too many requests, right? Because this has a limit of 100 requests per minute, right? And if we'll wait a minute, we can see that this limit will reset, and we should be able to access the reviews again. Oh, too many requests again. Hopefully a minute has passed for that other one. Yeah, a minute passed for the other one. Now we can do another request per that minute, but after the second request, we get too many requests again, right? So everything seems to be working as expected here. Let's talk about a little bit about how to debug this thing in case stuff doesn't work as expected. If there are any questions, feel free to write them in the chat. And I written some debugging hints in the README, so you can always access it later. So when debugging this kind of stuff, first thing we want to do is port forward to the debug ports of everything. So the first one is the debug port of product page, then is a debug port of the reviews, and then the debug port of rate limit. And you can, if you want to review Envoy logs, again, a reminder, we've done episodes on Envoy debugging multiple times, so I'm not going to go through this. But you can set the debug log level to debug, and then you can view the logs of the Envoy sidecars. And with debug level, it's really slow, so by no means don't do it in production. You can see the request as it flows through Envoy, and you can see exactly where it is, where it's going, what's the errors, what's happening. Another thing you can see is the config dump, and the reason you might want to look at that, because one thing you want to do is you want to confirm that the filler was added as you expect. So if we get the config dump here, let's see, should be a rate limit filter, rate limit. So first thing we see, sorry, that's the cluster metadata. Let me just search for the rate limit cluster. What was the name? Sorry about that. The name was rate_limit cluster, of course. Here we go. So we can see that the cluster was added exactly as we defined it, and you can see that the filter was added if we go here, that's the list of the filter. You see the HTTP rate limit filter was added as we defined. So these are kind of ways you can, because this config patches essentially get to Envoy, the way to see that they were applied, you go to the Envoy config dump and look, right? So another thing we can do, if you want to make sure you have the right limits, is to check the state of Redis. And there should be nothing there right now because it's been a few minutes. Oh no, I guess I made some calls. So you can see that we have, all the keys in Redis that specify how many hits we had for various things. And you can see, make sure that it's rate limiting or not rate limiting as you expect. All right, that was our short overview for today for the Envoy Filter CRD. If there are no questions, I'm gonna go a quick summary and we'll wrap up for today. If there are questions, please feel free to write them in our chat. I'm monitoring it as we speak. So let's go back to the reference docs. Always refer to the docs, it'll save you a lot of headache. So why do we want to use Envoy filters? Essentially, we want to use them when we have to, right? When we have an API or a use case that we want to implement, but we don't have an API to implement it with in Istio, right? An Envoy filter allows us to use Istio to stream Envoy config directly to Envoy, right? And kind of turns Istio to a general purpose Envoy control plane. The disadvantage of it, Istio doesn't know what this config means. It cannot validate it. It cannot, make sure that it's working correctly. So it's kind of on you. You have to make sure that it's working. You have to know Envoy very well in order to use this feature. And it's on you to make sure you didn't break anything, right? Once you do that, Istio can't help you figure out why something's not working. Another disadvantage, you see this little V1 Alpha 3. So this CRD is an alpha right now. I know it's in the process of moving into beta, but for right now it's alpha, which means that YAMLs that you write today might break in a future version. And again, this is a breakless API, and it's meant to be used when you have to. If you can do something with the regular Istio APIs, you should use the regular Istio API to do them. Now, let's. As a reminder, the Envoy Filter CRD has a workload selector that says what workload it applies on, and a set of config patches that says what Envoy, what Envoy part of the config they apply to. And finally, the patch that says what is the JSON that we're adding to Envoy and how are we doing this? Are we merging? Are we adding? Are we inserting before a different object in a list, etc.? And this is the Envoy, the Istio reference doc. There's a bunch of examples here that you can use to kind of see and get familiar with what this object does. It's a very powerful object. And again, I think the main disadvantage is that you have to really know Envoy well in order to use this well. All right, I see we don't have questions for today. This is our new episode of our new season. And I hope you come again and watch our next episodes. And thank you everybody for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Goodbye everyone.